At 73 years old, I thought I knew what silence meant. I'd been living in it for 12 years, ever since the progressive hearing loss that started as a whisper and ended as complete deafness took away the last sounds of my world. The doctors called it sensorineural hearing loss. Irreversible, they said. Permanent. They were wrong. Dr. Martinez at the University Medical Center was young, enthusiastic about new technologies in ways that older physicians had stopped being. When she first mentioned the experimental cochlear implant procedure, I almost dismissed it. I'd heard promises before, but something in her eyes reminded me of my late wife, Eleanor. That spark of hope that refuses to be extinguished by practical concerns. The success rate for your type of hearing loss is remarkable, she explained, though I had to read her lips and rely on her written notes. 93% of patients experience significant hearing restoration. Some report hearing better than they had in decades. I scheduled the procedure for a Tuesday in October, telling no one. My 3 children, David, Patricia, and Michael, thought I was visiting my old friend Frank upstate for the week. In truth, Frank had been dead for 2 years, but they'd never bothered to check on the details of my so-called social life. The surgery itself was easier than I'd expected. Local anesthetic, a few hours under careful monitoring, then recovery time while my brain relearned how to process sound. Dr. Martinez activated the implant on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the procedure. The first sound I heard was her voice saying, "Can you hear me, Mr. Thompson?" I nearly wept. It wasn't perfect, electronic, slightly hollow, like voices coming through an old radio. But it was sound. Real, actual sound after 12 years of nothing but the visual world and the vibrations I could feel through solid surfaces. "Take your time adjusting," she said. "Your brain needs to remember how to interpret these signals. Start with quiet environments and gradually expose yourself to more complex soundscapes." I drove home in wonder, hearing my car engine for the first time in over a decade. The turn signals. The radio playing music I'd forgotten existed. Even the mundane sound of tires on asphalt felt like a miracle. But I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted to surprise my family at Thanksgiving dinner, just 6 weeks away. I imagined their faces when they realized their deaf father could suddenly hear every word. Patricia's laugh. David's voice when he told his stories about work. Michael's children, my grandchildren, when they called me grandpa instead of signing it with their hands. For 6 weeks, I would listen to their world without them knowing I could hear. I thought it would be the most beautiful gift I could give myself before revealing the miracle. I had no idea I was about to discover something that would shatter more than just my silence. 2. The quiet joy. The world had changed while I was away from it. Birds sounded different than I remembered. Sharper, more complex. The wind through the oak tree in my backyard carried layers of sound I'd never noticed before my deafness. Leaves rustling against each other, branches creaking, even the subtle whistle as air moved through different shaped spaces in the foliage. Music was revelation. I spent my first week home rediscovering my old vinyl collection, playing records I'd loved 40 years ago and hearing instruments I'd forgotten existed. The bass lines in songs I thought I knew completely. The way certain voices layered over others in harmonies that had been invisible to me even when I could hear. My house, which I'd thought was silent, was actually full of sound. The refrigerator hummed. The old radiator clanked when the heat came on. Floorboards creaked in specific patterns as I walked across rooms I'd traversed thousands of times. Even my own breathing created sound, something I'd never consciously noticed before losing my hearing. But the real joy came from watching my family with this new secret knowledge. David visited on Saturday afternoon, as he had every weekend for years. Usually our interactions were visual. Him speaking slowly so I could read his lips, me responding with the few words I trusted myself to pronounce correctly, both of us relying heavily on gestures and written notes. Now I could hear him. "How are you feeling, Dad?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my recliner. "Good," I replied carefully, maintaining the speaking patterns I'd developed during my deaf years. "How's work?" But now I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the way he paused before answering questions about his job. I could hear him checking his phone constantly, the buzz of text messages he thought I couldn't detect. I could hear him walking through the house while I pretended to nap, opening cabinet doors, looking through my mail. Patricia came by on Tuesday with groceries, as she had faithfully for years. She was the most attentive of my 3 children, the one who'd learned sign language and made sure I had everything I needed. Hearing her voice again was like meeting someone I'd known only through letters. "I got you those crackers you like," she said, unpacking bags in my kitchen. "And the coffee you can't find at the regular store." But I also heard her phone calls, which she made while thinking I couldn't overhear from the next room. Conversations about her mortgage, her husband's medical bills, her daughter's college tuition. Financial pressures I'd never known she was facing because she'd never asked me for help. Michael was the most surprising. My youngest, who'd always seemed scattered and unreliable, spoke with warmth and genuine affection when he thought I couldn't hear his tone. He'd tell his children, "Be gentle with Grandpa, he can't hear you." But then he'd talk to them about me in voices full of love and respect. For 3 weeks, I lived in this secret world of rediscovered sound and deeper understanding of my family. I heard my grandchildren playing in the backyard, their laughter and games more complex than anything I could have observed just by watching. I heard Patricia humming while she cleaned my kitchen. I heard David talking to his wife on the phone about Christmas plans that included me. They loved me, despite the burden of caring for a deaf elderly parent, despite the extra effort required to communicate with me, despite whatever inconveniences my limitations created in their lives. They genuinely loved me. I fell asleep each night planning my Thanksgiving surprise, imagining how moved they'd be to learn that their father could hear again, how we'd finally have the conversations we'd been struggling toward for 12 years, how I'd be able to tell them how much their care and patience had meant to me. Then came the Wednesday evening that changed everything. I was dozing in my recliner after dinner, the way I often did while watching television with the captions on. David, Patricia, and Michael were in the kitchen, cleaning up dishes and talking in what they believed were private voices. The first words I heard clearly were Patricia saying, "We need to move fast." I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, but every nerve in my body was suddenly alert. "Dad doesn't know anything anymore," David replied. "Half the time he doesn't even remember what day it is." "We can't wait much longer," Michael added. "The house alone is worth $400,000, plus the savings, plus the pension. My children, the 3 people I'd sacrificed everything to raise and educate and support, were planning to steal from me. And they thought their deaf father couldn't hear every single word." 3. The betrayal. I'd heard enough betrayal stories in my 73 years to know they usually unfold in whispers and assumptions. What I wasn't prepared for was how clinical my own children could be when they thought no one was listening. "The power of attorney paperwork is already prepared," Patricia was saying, her voice matter-of-fact in the way she might discuss a grocery list. "He just needs to sign it. We tell him it's for medical decisions, nothing about finances." "And he'll sign it?" David asked. "Of course he will. He trusts us completely. He's been depending on us for everything since Mom died." They were right about that. After Eleanor's death 8 years ago, followed by my hearing loss 4 years later, I'd leaned heavily on my children's help. They'd guided me through insurance paperwork, helped me navigate Medicare, assisted with banking when the procedures became too complicated for me to handle alone. They'd earned my trust through years of apparent care and support. Now I understood it had all been preparation for this moment. "What about the legal side?" Michael asked. "If someone investigates later?" "Who's going to investigate?" Patricia laughed, a sound that had brought me joy just moments before but now made my stomach turn. "He's an isolated old man with hearing loss and early dementia. If anyone asks questions, we'll have documentation showing he willingly transferred authority to his children because he couldn't manage his affairs anymore." "Does he actually have dementia?" David asked. "He will by the time we're finished," Patricia replied. "Dr. Brennan will confirm whatever we need him to confirm." Dr. Brennan, my family doctor for 15 years, who I'd trusted with every aspect of my health and medical care. Apparently that trust was misplaced as well. "The timing has to be perfect," Michael said. "Once we have power of attorney, we transfer the house to the LLC, move the savings into the trust account, and get him placed in the state facility." "State facility?" David sounded surprised. "The good nursing homes cost $6,000 a month," Patricia explained patiently. The state facility costs us nothing and gives us complete control over his care decisions. Plus, it supports the narrative that his mental state deteriorated, and we had no choice but to take over his affairs. I sat in my chair, eyes closed, controlling my breathing, while my children planned to steal my life savings and warehouse me in what I knew was essentially a holding place for elderly people whose families couldn't or wouldn't pay for decent care. What if he resists? Michael asked. What if he figures out what's happening? He won't, David replied confidently. He can't hear us, he can barely communicate, and he's becoming more confused every month. By the time he realizes anything's wrong, it'll be legally too late for him to do anything about it. Besides, Patricia added, where would he go? Who would he tell? He doesn't have any friends left. He doesn't leave the house except for doctor visits, and we control his access to communication. Even if he wanted to fight it, he doesn't have the resources or connections to challenge what we're doing. They talked for another 20 minutes, discussing timelines and logistics with the efficiency of people planning a business transaction. Which, I realized, was exactly what this was to them. I wasn't their father who'd worked 60-hour weeks to pay for their educations, who'd sat up nights when they were sick, who'd sacrificed my own comfort and retirement dreams to make sure they had everything they needed. I was an asset to be liquidated. When they finally left that evening, each of them kissing my forehead and telling me they loved me, I sat alone in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death. The profound loneliness that comes from realizing the people you love most in the world are not who you thought they were. But I also felt something else. Something cold and calculating that reminded me of the man I'd been during my 40-year career in accounting and financial planning, when I'd built the very fortune my children were now scheming to steal. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who couldn't hear their plans. They were wrong on both counts. 4. The heartbreak sleep didn't come that night. I lay in the bed Eleanor and I had shared for 35 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to sounds I was still relearning to interpret. The house settling, wind through the trees, a car passing on the street outside, and in my mind, over and over, the voices of my children planning to destroy me. I'd known betrayal before, in business and friendships, but nothing had prepared me for the specific pain of discovering that the people you'd spent your life protecting were planning to strip away your dignity, your independence, and your security. In your final years, the worst part wasn't the money, though losing my life savings would have left me vulnerable and dependent in ways that terrified me. The worst part was the calculation behind it. The way they'd discussed me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cared for. Patricia, who'd seemed so devoted, had been the ringleader. My only daughter, who I'd walked down the aisle at her wedding, who'd brought her children to me every week to maintain their relationship with their grandfather. She'd been planning to warehouse me in a state facility so she could steal my house. David, my eldest, who I'd been so proud of for his career in law, had been using his legal knowledge not to protect me but to ensure their theft would be legally unassailable. And Michael, my youngest, who I'd always worried didn't have enough direction in life, had apparently found his purpose in calculating the value of my assets and planning how to access them. I thought about the sacrifices Eleanor and I had made, the vacations we'd skipped to pay for their college educations, the years I'd worked overtime and weekend consulting jobs to build the savings they were now planning to steal, the way we'd delayed our own retirement dreams, our own comfort to make sure they had every advantage we could give them. Eleanor would have been devastated. She'd loved our children fiercely, believed in them completely. She'd died thinking we'd raised 3 good people who would take care of each other and honor the family we'd built together. Instead, we'd apparently raised 3 sociopaths who saw their father's old age as a business opportunity. I considered my options as the night stretched on. I could confront them directly, tell them I'd overheard their conversation and demand they abandon their plan. But that would only force them to be more careful, more secretive. They'd find other ways to achieve the same goal. I could disappear, liquidate my assets myself, move somewhere they couldn't find me, start over in a new city where I could live out my remaining years in peace. But running felt like defeat, like letting them win without consequences for what they'd planned to do. Or I could use the one advantage they didn't know I had. I could hear every word they said, while they believed I was deaf and becoming mentally incompetent. By morning, I'd made my decision. If my children wanted to play games with a confused old man, I'd give them exactly what they expected. But they were about to learn that some old men become confused like foxes become confused, with more cunning than anyone expects. The next 48 hours would be about gathering intelligence and building a case. After that, I'd show them what a 40-year career in financial planning could do when motivated by love betrayed and trust shattered. They thought they were dealing with someone who couldn't hear their schemes and couldn't understand their implications. They were about to discover how wrong they were about both. 5. The plan Thursday morning. I called my attorney's office using the old TTY device I'd used during my deaf years, typing out messages that were converted to speech for the receptionist. I need an appointment with Mr. Harrison, I typed. Urgent estate planning matter. He has an opening Monday at 10, came the typed response. Perfect. Please don't put this appointment under my regular name. Use the name Frank Richardson. Frank had been my closest friend before his death 2 years ago. I knew none of my children had ever bothered to learn his full name. Richard Harrison had been my attorney for 20 years. He'd handled Eleanor's estate, helped me navigate the legal complexities of my hearing loss, and updated my will 3 times over the past decade. More importantly, he was one of the few people who'd known me well enough before my deafness to recognize that my mental faculties were completely intact. Friday morning, Patricia arrived with groceries and her usual cheerful demeanor. I watched her performance with new eyes, seeing the calculation behind every gesture of care and affection. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" she asked, speaking loudly and clearly the way she always did. "Good," I replied, maintaining my limited vocabulary and careful pronunciation. "Tired." "You should rest more," she said, unpacking groceries with practiced efficiency. "You're not as young as you used to be." While she worked in the kitchen, I listened to her phone calls to her brothers. They'd scheduled their next planning meeting for Sunday afternoon after what they called the old man's nap time. "The paperwork is ready," she told David. "We just need to find the right moment to present it to him. Make it seem routine." Saturday, Michael arrived with his children for their weekly visit. 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jake had learned basic sign language to communicate with me, and their innocent attempts to include their grandfather in their games had been one of my greatest joys over the past few years. Now I could hear them whispering to each other while Michael talked to his wife in the next room. "Why does Daddy say Grandpa doesn't understand things?" Emma asked Jake. "He always understands when we play games." "Grown-ups talk weird," Jake replied with 6-year-old wisdom. Their father, meanwhile, was discussing my deteriorating condition with his wife. "We'll need to move fast," he said. "Dad's getting more confused, and we can't wait until he's completely incompetent. The legal transfer needs to happen while he can still sign documents." Sunday afternoon, I settled into my recliner for my usual post-lunch nap, while all 3 of my children gathered in my kitchen for what they thought was a private strategy session. "I've scheduled the signing for Thursday," Patricia announced. "Dr. Brennan will be there as a witness to Dad's mental state. The story is that we're helping him organize his medical care directives." "What about the financial power of attorney?" David asked. "Same document. He won't read the fine print, and even if he tries, he'll trust us to explain it correctly." "And the house transfer?" "That happens the following week. Once we have power of attorney, we can act in his best interests. The transfer protects the asset from potential nursing home costs." They spent 90 minutes discussing details with the thoroughness of people planning a military operation. Asset protection strategies, timeline management, cover stories for each step of the process, legal precedents that would support their actions if anyone questioned them later. I recorded every word using the small digital recorder I'd bought years ago to help me remember doctor's appointments when I couldn't hear their instructions clearly. Monday morning, I kept my appointment with Richard Harrison. Frank Richardson had been a precaution in case any of my children somehow monitored my appointments. But when I walked into his office and he saw me clearly, Richard's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Tom, you look wonderful," he said, then paused. "Wait, did you just respond to me speaking?" "I had surgery," I told him. "Cochlear implant, I can hear again." "That's fantastic. When did this happen? Why didn't you tell me?" 3 weeks ago, and I haven't told anyone. That's why I'm here." I spent the next 2 hours explaining what I'd discovered and playing the recordings I'd made. Richard's expression grew darker with each revelation. "This is elder fraud," he said when I'd finished. "It's also conspiracy to commit fraud. Depending on how they handle the asset transfers, it could be federal wire fraud. They're looking at serious prison time if we can prove intent." "Can we prove intent?" "You've recorded them planning the entire scheme. That's pretty clear evidence of intent." "What do I need to do?" "First, we're going to revise your estate planning completely. Create an irrevocable trust that removes the assets from your direct ownership but gives you lifetime use and control. Second, we're going to set up monitoring on all your financial accounts so we can document any unauthorized access attempts. Third, we're going to bring in a private investigator to document their activities and gather additional evidence." "How long will this take?" "If we move fast, everything can be in place by Thursday. That gives us time to prepare before they try to execute their plan." "And then?" Richard smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 30 years protecting clients from exactly this kind of betrayal. "Then we let them hang themselves with their own rope." 6. The trap is set. By Wednesday evening, Richard had restructured my entire financial life in ways that would have impressed my old colleagues from my accounting days. The house, my savings, my pension, my investments, everything had been transferred to the Thomas Franklin Thompson Irrevocable Trust, with me as the lifetime beneficiary and Richard as the trustee. On paper, I owned nothing. In reality, I controlled everything. More importantly, any attempt to access these assets using fraudulent power of attorney documents would trigger automatic notifications to both Richard and the private investigator he'd hired, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in elder fraud cases. "Your children are about to discover that you can't steal what doesn't exist," Richard explained during our final preparation meeting. "When they try to execute their plan, they'll be attempting to gain power of attorney over assets that aren't legally yours anymore." "What happens then?" "The trust documents show that you transferred these assets while mentally competent and with proper legal representation. Their power of attorney documents, even if legitimately signed, won't give them access to trust assets. When they try to claim you were incompetent at the time of signing, Dr. Martinez's medical records will prove you were actually recovering from successful surgery that improved your cognitive function." Dr. Martinez had been delighted to provide detailed medical documentation of my cochlear implant surgery and recovery. She'd also included cognitive assessments that showed my mental acuity was actually above average for my age group. Sarah Chen had spent 3 days documenting my children's activities and communications. She'd photographed them meeting with Dr. Brennan, recorded phone conversations about asset transfers, and gathered evidence of their research into state care facilities and nursing home costs. "They've been planning this for months," she reported. "Maybe longer. I found online searches on Patricia's computer dating back 6 months, looking into power of attorney laws and elder care legal requirements." Thursday morning arrived with an autumn chill that matched my mood. Patricia called to remind me about our appointment that afternoon. "Just some paperwork to help us take better care of you, Dad," she said with false cheerfulness. "Nothing complicated." I spent the morning listening to music and thinking about Eleanor. She'd always been the optimist in our marriage, the one who saw the best in people even when experience suggested caution. I wondered what she would think about what I was about to do. Then I remembered her voice, weak but fierce, during her final illness. "Promise me you won't let anyone take advantage of you when you're old and alone." I'd promised her I'd be strong enough to protect myself. Today, I was keeping that promise. At 2 o'clock, Patricia, David, and Michael arrived together, which was unusual enough to be suspicious. They were accompanied by Dr. Brennan and a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as a notary public. "Dad, we've brought some people to help us organize your medical care," Patricia said, speaking loudly and slowly. "They need you to sign some documents so we can help you better." "Dr. Wen." Brennan stepped forward with a performance of professional concern that would have been convincing if I hadn't known better. "Tom, I need to ask you some questions to make sure you understand what we're discussing today." He ran through a basic mental competency assessment. Questions about the date, my address, my children's names. Standard procedures, except I could hear Patricia coaching my responses under her breath, thinking I couldn't detect her whispered prompts. He's clearly capable of making these decisions, Doctor, Brennan announced to the room. The power of attorney documents can be witnessed and notarized. They presented me with a thick stack of papers, explaining each section in deliberately simplistic terms while Patricia held my hand in what she believed was a comforting gesture. This just lets us help with medical decisions, she explained. And this section lets us help with paying bills and managing finances. Nothing changes for you. We just want to make sure everything is taken care of properly. I listened to every word while maintaining the confused but trusting expression they expected. Then I signed every document they placed in front of me, just as they'd planned. What they didn't know was that Richard Harrison was parked outside my house, waiting for my text message. The moment the notary finished certifying the last document, I sent it. It's done. 5 minutes later, Richard walked in with Sarah Chen and a uniformed police officer. "Excuse me," Richard announced to the room. "I'm Thomas Thompson's attorney. I believe there may be some confusion about these documents you're having him sign." 7. The collapse. The silence that followed Richard's entrance was unlike anything I'd experienced, even during my 12 years of deafness. It was the silence of people who'd just realized their carefully constructed plan was falling apart in real time. Patricia recovered first, switching immediately to her most professional voice. "I'm sorry. Who are you? Dad didn't mention expecting anyone else today." "Richard Harrison, Mr. Thompson's attorney for the past 20 years. He placed his briefcase on my dining room table and began removing documents. "I represent his interests in all legal matters, including estate planning and asset protection." David stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling legal situations. "I'm David Thompson, Tom's eldest son and an attorney myself. These are routine medical and financial care documents. Nothing that requires outside counsel." "Routine?" Sarah Chen spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone holding all the cards. "You mean the documents that would give you power of attorney over assets that your father no longer legally owns?" I watched my children's faces as they processed this information. The confusion was immediate and genuine. "What do you mean he doesn't own the assets?" Patricia asked. Richard smiled with professional satisfaction. 3 days ago, Mr. Thompson transferred all of his assets to an irrevocable trust. The house, the savings accounts, the investments, the pension, none of it is legally his property anymore. Your power of attorney documents, even if legitimately obtained, would give you authority over exactly nothing. "That's impossible," Michael said. "Dad can't hear well enough to understand complex legal procedures. He couldn't have made that kind of decision without our help." "Actually, he can hear perfectly well," Sarah Chen announced, pulling out her own recording device. "Mr. Thompson underwent successful cochlear implant surgery 6 weeks ago. His hearing is completely restored, which means he heard every word of your planning meetings, including the one where you discussed warehousing him in a state facility to steal his assets." The color drained from Patricia's face. "That's not... We weren't..." "Sunday afternoon," I said quietly, speaking clearly for the first time in 12 years in front of my children. "In my kitchen, while I was supposedly napping. You discussed the timeline, the legal strategy, and Dr. Brennan's cooperation in documenting my alleged mental incompetence." Dr. Brennan, who'd been standing near the back of the room, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. David, trained attorney that he was, tried to recover control of the situation. "Even if that's true, caring for an elderly parent with medical needs isn't a crime. We were trying to protect Dad's interests." "By transferring his house to an LLC you control?" Sarah asked. "By placing him in the cheapest state facility you could find? By lying to him about the contents of legal documents?" Richard opened his briefcase and began laying out documents on the table. "We have recordings of your planning meetings. We have documentation of your research into asset transfer strategies and elder care facilities. We have evidence of your coordination with a medical professional to provide false testimony about your father's mental capacity. More importantly," Sarah added, "we have proof that you intended to defraud an elderly person of his life savings through deception and manipulation. That's elder abuse. It's also fraud, conspiracy, and depending on the dollar amounts involved, it could be prosecuted as a federal crime." The notary public, who'd been quietly documenting everything she'd witnessed, suddenly looked very uncomfortable about her role in the proceedings. Patricia made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Dad, surely you don't believe we would actually hurt you? We're your children. We love you. We were trying to protect you." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bicycle, whose homework I'd helped with every night for 12 years, who I'd walked down the aisle at her wedding, and felt nothing but profound sadness. "Patricia," I said calmly, "I heard you laugh when you discussed putting me in a state facility. I heard you calculate the value of my assets and plan how to transfer them into accounts I couldn't access. I heard you discuss hiring a doctor to declare me mentally incompetent so your theft would be legally protected. That's not what we meant." "I heard exactly what you meant." The police officer, who'd been silently observing the entire confrontation, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that elder fraud is a serious criminal offense in this state. You have the right to remain silent." "This is insane," Michael protested. "You can't arrest us for trying to take care of our father." "Actually," Richard said, "we can arrest you for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft of assets, and elder abuse. The recordings alone provide sufficient evidence for prosecution." Sarah Chen had been quietly filming the entire confrontation with a small camera. "We also have documentation of your communications with accomplices, your research into fraudulent power of attorney procedures, and your coordination with a medical professional to provide false testimony." Dr. Brennan, apparently realizing his professional career was about to end, tried to leave quietly. The police officer blocked his path. "Dr. Brennan, you're also under investigation for conspiracy and professional misconduct." I sat in my chair, listening to my children's denials and excuses and desperate attempts to minimize their intentions, and felt strangely peaceful. Eleanor had been right. I was strong enough to protect myself when it mattered. "The irony," Richard said to the room, "is that if you'd simply asked your father for help with your financial problems, he probably would have helped you. Instead, you chose to steal from him and abandon him in a state facility." Patricia was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration at being caught. "What happens now?" David asked, his legal training finally overcoming his shock. "Now," Sarah Chen announced, "you face the consequences of elder fraud. Prison time, financial restitution, and professional sanctions for those of you with professional licenses." The police officer began reading them their rights. As they were led away, Patricia turned back to me one last time. "Dad, please, we're still your children." "No," I said quietly. "You stopped being my children the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive." The house fell silent again after everyone left. But this time, it was the good kind of silence. The silence of truth told and justice served. I sat in my recliner and listened to the sounds of the world I'd thought I'd lost forever. Birds singing outside my window, the wind through the oak tree, the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. 8. The aftermath. The legal proceedings took 8 months to resolve. Patricia, David, and Michael each faced multiple felony charges for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, attempted theft of assets over $100,000, and criminal exploitation of an elderly person. Dr. Brennan lost his medical license and faced additional charges for professional misconduct and conspiracy. The irony wasn't lost on me that David, as an attorney, received the harshest sentence because the court considered his legal knowledge an aggravating factor in the crime. He'd used his professional expertise not to protect a vulnerable client, but to design a more sophisticated theft. None of them went to prison, ultimately. Richard negotiated plea agreements that included probation, community service, and financial restitution, though there was nothing to restore since they'd never actually succeeded in stealing anything. More importantly to me, the plea agreements included restraining orders that prevented them from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. I never spoke to any of them again. The one exception was Emma, Michael's 8-year-old daughter, who'd been my greatest joy during the years when I thought I couldn't hear her voice. When the initial shock of the arrest settled and the family dynamics rearranged themselves around this new reality, her mother brought her to see me one afternoon. "I don't understand why Daddy can't come with me anymore," Emma said, her small hands moving in the sign language she'd learned to communicate with her grandfather. I knelt down to her level so we could talk face to face. "Emma, I can hear you now. You don't need to sign anymore." Her eyes widened with delight. "Really? You can hear me talking?" "I can hear everything. Your voice is even more beautiful than I remembered." We spent 2 hours talking, really talking, for the first time in her life. About school, about her friends, about the books she was reading and the games she liked to play. Her mother sat quietly in my kitchen, giving us space to build this new kind of relationship. "Will I still be able to visit you?" Emma asked eventually. "As long as your mother is willing to bring you, I'll always want to see you." "Good," she said with 8-year-old decisiveness. "I like having a grandpa who can hear me." Emma and her mother, Jennifer, became my primary family connection. Jennifer had always been the kindest of my children's spouses, and she made it clear that she'd had no knowledge of her husband's plans and was horrified by what he'd attempted to do. "Michael never told me he was having financial problems," she explained during one of their visits. "I had no idea he was so desperate that he'd consider something like this." One evening in late September, as I sat on my dock watching the sunset over the water, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Patricia's voice. "Dad? Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you." I could have ended the call. The restraining order had expired 6 months earlier, and there was nothing legally preventing her from calling me. But I was curious about what she thought she could possibly say after everything that had happened. "What do you want, Patricia?" "I want to apologize. I want to explain. I want to try to make things right between us." "There's nothing right to make. You planned to steal everything I'd worked for and abandon me in a state facility. What explanation could possibly justify that?" She was crying, which might have moved me a year ago, but now just sounded like another form of manipulation. "We were desperate," she said. "My marriage was falling apart. I was losing the house. Sarah needed surgery we couldn't afford. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were thinking very clearly. I heard you planning every detail for months. Please, Dad. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm still your daughter. We're still family." "No," I said calmly. "Family doesn't calculate the value of your assets while planning to declare you mentally incompetent. Family doesn't laugh about putting you in the cheapest possible care facility. Family doesn't steal from you and then claim they were protecting you. But, Patricia, I heard every word you said. I heard how you talked about me when you thought I couldn't understand. That wasn't desperation talking. That was who you really are when no one is watching." She was sobbing now, but I felt nothing. The man who would have been moved by his daughter's tears had died the night I heard her planning to betray me. "I've learned something important about family," I continued. "It's not about blood relations or shared history. It's about trust and respect and genuinely caring about each other's well-being. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a father. Please." I hung up. She called back twice that evening, but I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say to any of them.